The dim light of the fading afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the cluttered taxi office. Papers were scattered across the desks, old coffee cups sat on windowsills, and the smell of stale air hung in the room like an uninvited guest. Outside, the streets were alive with the bustle of the city, horns honking, people shouting, and the sounds of life rushing by. Inside, however, there was only one voice that cut through the chaos: Mr. Donnelly's. "Ethan!" Mr. Donnelly's voice cracked like thunder as he slammed a hand on the desk, his face turning a shade darker with every passing second. "What the hell is wrong with you? Another messed up shift? Another customer complaint? Do you even care about this job?" Ethan stood in front of him, shoulders tense, hands clenched at his sides. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding the seething anger in his boss's eyes. It was always like this: Mr. Donnelly yelling, belittling him, and Ethan, always trying to avoid conflict, simply absorbing it all. "I'm sorry, Mr. Donnelly," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was traffic, and I tried." "Traffic?" Mr. Donnelly interrupted, his voice rising higher, filled with disbelief. "You're a taxi driver. You're supposed to know where the traffic is. This isn't a joke, Ethan. This is a business, my business, and if you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can." Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, and his palms were sweaty. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. He'd been working here for months, and yet every day felt like he was walking on eggshells. All he wanted was a chance to prove himself, but it seemed like no matter what he did, it was never enough. "I'm doing my best," Ethan said, his voice finally gaining some strength. "I'm trying, I swear." But Mr. Donnelly wasn't having any of it. "Trying? That's not good enough. You're failing." His words were sharp, each one cutting into Ethan's pride like a blade. "I've given you chance after chance. You're this close to being out of here. You'd better get it together or you're gone." Ethan opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He knew arguing wouldn't change anything. The man was stubborn, set in his ways. His face burned with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. What was he supposed to do? He was stuck, trapped in a cycle he couldn't seem to break. Just then, as if the universe had decided that enough was enough, the door to the office creaked open. Ethan glanced up in surprise, blinking against the harsh light streaming in from the hallway. A figure stood in the doorway, a man dressed casually, with a quiet confidence about him. He wasn't someone Ethan recognized, but there was something immediately familiar about him. The man seemed out of place in the dingy office, like a character from a movie who had just stepped into reality. Mr. Donnelly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he took in the new arrival. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the stranger flashed a calm, almost amused smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the man said, his voice smooth and deliberate with just a hint of charm. "I'm looking for a taxi. Couldn't help but overhear. A little tension here." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The man's face was familiar. He was sure he'd seen him somewhere before, but he couldn't quite place it. The stranger's presence filled the room, almost like he was a part of the scenery, yet commanding attention without trying. And for a split second, the office seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat, momentarily at a loss for words. Can I help you, sir?" His tone was far more measured now, the sudden appearance of a celebrity catching him off guard. Johnny offered a nonchalant smile, as if this kind of situation were an everyday occurrence for him. "I'm actually looking for a ride," he said, stepping further into the room. "But I couldn't help overhearing." He glanced at Ethan and then at Mr. Donnelly, his eyes twinkling with a knowing look. "Sounds like things are a bit tense?" Ethan could hardly believe it. Johnny Depp, in his worn jeans and leather jacket, was casually commenting on the argument that had just almost torn him apart. The reality of it hit him like a wave. He had never been good at processing such moments. Mr. Donnelly, still struggling to regain control of the situation, took a step forward. "I don't know what kind of joke this is," he muttered, his tone sharp, but he couldn't hide the respect that lingered beneath the irritation. "But we're in the middle of something here." Johnny didn't flinch. His cool demeanor remained. "You know," he said softly, as if considering his words carefully, "sometimes the best way to fix a problem is not to address it head-on. Maybe you're missing something here." Ethan stared at him, uncertain whether he was hearing things or if this was really happening. The famous actor wasn't just in the room, he was offering advice. It didn't make sense. Johnny turned toward Ethan, his eyes meeting his with a soft, reassuring gaze. "I know things aren't easy right now, but sometimes, when the world feels like it's falling apart, all you need is someone to remind you that the story isn't over yet." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was as if Johnny had taken the words straight from his own heart, thoughts that he had never been able to voice. A mixture of disbelief and something akin to hope swirled inside him. Johnny's calm gaze lingered on Ethan, as if the entire room was waiting for him to decide whether or not he was ready for the change that could come from this moment. Mr. Donnelly was visibly taken aback by Johnny's words, clearly unsure how to handle this encounter. His earlier anger had turned into a strange mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Are you offering advice now, Mr. Depp?" he scoffed. "I'm just trying to run a business here." Johnny's smile deepened, almost mischievous. "I'm not offering advice," he replied, his tone calm yet with a certain authority. "I'm offering a different way of seeing things. If you let me, I think we can solve this together." Ethan, still reeling from the situation, felt something stir within him. Johnny's words weren't just comforting. They were challenging him to look beyond the anger, beyond the frustration, and to see the bigger picture. Johnny tilted his head slightly, his gaze turning back to Ethan. "You know, you remind me of someone I used to know. A guy who had a lot of heart but didn't know where to put it. Sometimes that's the hardest part of life, figuring out where your heart belongs." Ethan, lost in Johnny's words, didn't know how to respond. The thought of being understood by someone who had lived through the ups and downs of fame, someone who had faced battles of his own, was overwhelming. For a moment, everything else in the room faded away. Johnny took a few steps closer, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not saying it's easy, but if you're ready for something different, I can show you a way that might make all the difference." Ethan's mind raced. Was this really happening? Was Johnny Depp, of all people, offering him a chance to change? His heart beat faster as he glanced at Mr. Donnelly, who was now eyeing Johnny with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. The tension in the room hung in the air, but there was something different about it now. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the presence of a celebrity. Ethan felt it, a spark of possibility that he hadn't felt in a long time. Johnny's voice dropped to a whisper, his words carrying a weight that seemed to echo in Ethan's mind. "But only if you're willing to listen. A chance to change." The office was quieter now, the tension still hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ethan's heart was racing, his mind caught between disbelief and hope. Johnny Depp, standing in front of him with the calmness of someone who had seen it all, had just offered him a lifeline. A way out of the endless cycle of failure and frustration that had been choking him for months. Mr. Donnelly was silent, his arms crossed as he watched the exchange between Ethan and Johnny. His face was hard to read, a mix of skepticism and grudging respect in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any of this. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under Johnny's gaze. The room felt both smaller and larger at the same time. The air was thick with possibility, and yet the weight of his boss's disapproval hung over him like a cloud. Johnny's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "So, Ethan, what do you think? Are you ready to take a different path?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak but found that no words came out. He had always been someone who played it safe, who avoided confrontation and change at all costs. But something about Johnny's presence, something about his calm demeanor, made him want to take the risk. I don't know, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. I've been trying for so long and it just feels like nothing works. Every time I think I'm getting somewhere, something goes wrong. Johnny nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly how Ethan felt. I get it. But that's the thing about life. It's unpredictable. Things don't always go according to plan. But that doesn't mean you give up. It just means you find a new way forward. Ethan's mind raced. Could he really do this? Could he really change his approach? The idea of stepping out of his comfort zone was terrifying, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way out of the endless loop of disappointment. I'm not asking you to do anything drastic, Johnny continued, his tone reassuring. Just take small steps. Try something different. Maybe it's time to stop trying to please everyone and start listening to what you really want. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent so much time trying to meet Mr. Donnelly's expectations, trying to fix every mistake and keep his head down, that he had lost sight of what he actually wanted, what he needed. Johnny turned to Mr. Donnelly, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the conversation. And you, Johnny said, his voice soft but firm. You have a choice too. Sometimes the best way to lead is to listen, to give people a chance to grow, not just to meet your standards, but to meet their own. Mr. Donnelly stiffened, clearly not used to being spoken to this way. He opened his mouth to retort but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. For the first time in a long while, Ethan could see the cracks in his boss's hard exterior. Maybe there was room for change here, for both of them. Johnny glanced back at Ethan. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to be willing to take the first step. Ethan nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He was terrified, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could take a chance. He could do something different. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to keep living in the shadow of his failures. Johnny smiled, the warmth in his expression reassuring. Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. And sometimes that progress starts with a single moment of bravery. With that, Johnny turned toward the door, giving one last glance at Ethan. I'll be outside waiting for that ride. Take your time. You've got this. Ethan stood there for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. Johnny Depp, the man who had seemed so far out of reach, had just shared a moment of real connection with him, offering more than just advice. He had offered a chance at redemption, a chance to start over, to rebuild his confidence. Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Well, that's one way to handle things, he muttered, shaking his head. But don't get any ideas, Ethan. I still run the show around here. Ethan barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the door, on the opportunity that had just been placed in front of him. Johnny Depp had shown him a different way, a new perspective, and now it was up to him to take the first step. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had the power to change his life. Ethan turned toward the door, ready to face the world outside with a new sense of purpose. But as he stepped into the hallway, a thought struck him. Could he really do this? Could he really change? Or was he just chasing another fleeting dream? The hallway was quiet, but Ethan's mind was anything but. His heart raced as he walked toward the exit, the weight of Johnny Depp's words still echoing in his mind. For the first time in ages, Ethan felt a spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. But the uncertainty was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. Could he really change? Could he really break free from the rut he had been in? He stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face and sending a chill through his body. The sky was overcast, the threat of rain hanging in the air. Johnny was leaning against the side of the taxi, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, looking more like an old friend than a superstar. His relaxed demeanor made Ethan feel like he was speaking to someone who understood the struggle, someone who had been through it and come out on the other side. "You ready?" Johnny asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Ethan nodded slowly, still unsure of what to say. I think so." Johnny pushed himself off the car, straightening up to face him. "Listen, change doesn't happen overnight. It's not about making a huge leap. It's about taking the first step. And that's what you just did." Ethan wasn't sure how to feel about that. He had done something, yes, but it wasn't enough to just say it. It wasn't enough to think it. He had to follow through. "Right," Ethan said, taking a deep breath. "The first step." Johnny smiled knowingly. "Exactly. And the hardest part is often the first step. But once you start walking, you'll realize it's not as hard as you think. It's the doubt and fear that make it feel impossible." Ethan looked at Johnny, trying to process the man's words. He had always seen Depp as an actor, a legend, someone larger than life. But now, in this moment, Johnny felt more like a mentor. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the way he seemed to just get it. But Ethan found himself listening intently, hanging on every word. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than he intended. Johnny paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Every day. But I don't let it define me. Everyone has their moments. The key is not to let them control you." Ethan swallowed hard, his nerves starting to settle. For the first time in ages, he didn't feel so alone in his struggles. "I guess it's just hard," Ethan admitted. "I've been stuck for so long. I don't know if I can find my way out." Johnny nodded, his expression calm but serious. "You won't find the way all at once, but you'll find it step by step. It's about progress, not perfection." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Ethan had always been so focused on doing things perfectly, on fixing every mistake, that he never gave himself a chance to grow. "You're right," Ethan said, a small sense of clarity starting to form. "I've been trying to fix everything instead of just moving forward. I guess I've been afraid to fail." Johnny's eyes softened. "Failure's just another part of the journey. It's not something to be afraid of. It's how you learn, how you grow." Ethan looked at Johnny, his gaze steady. "So, what now?" Johnny glanced toward the taxi. "Now? You take the first step. You try something new. You get in this car and start by doing one thing different. Even if it's small, it's a start." Ethan looked at the taxi, its headlights gleaming in the dim light. A simple car. But now it felt like a symbol of something bigger, a new beginning. Taking that first step felt less daunting now. Maybe it wasn't about knowing exactly where he was going. Maybe it was about moving forward, no matter how uncertain the path was. With a deep breath, Ethan climbed into the back seat, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Johnny followed him, sliding into the seat next to him. As the door slammed shut, the engine hummed to life. Johnny turned to him, a reassuring smile on his face. "Ready to make that change?" Ethan nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe change didn't have to be as impossible as it seemed. The taxi rolled forward, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. This was the first step. And for the first time, it didn't feel like the hardest thing he'd ever done. The road ahead was uncertain, but as the city lights blurred by, Ethan realized something. Maybe the journey wasn't about knowing where you were going. It was about finding the courage to take that first step, no matter how uncertain the path might be.